Hello? Yes. My name is Gary Machlis, and I'd like to talk about tensive science, collaborative science during crisis and conflict. There are several categories of tensive science, which includes a full range of political strains. For example, you can have political strains over science between parties, such as Republican and Democrat arguing about climate change science in the United States, a kind of important political strain. You can have the same thing between local and national missions. This is an image of, during Deepwater Horizon, the building of the controversial Burma Islands, where the national mission and the national scientific consensus was that they weren't going to work, and the local political and local scientists arguing it was worth the try. They failed. You can also have political strain, tensive science, between scientists and the public. This is an extraordinary image from the Pew and AAAS study, and for those of you in the back, it's hard to read the numbers. This is comparing the American general public and the scientific community on evolution. 87% of the scientists agreed that we, humans and other living things, have evolved over time due to natural processes. 87%. The general population, it's only 32%. Now think of that. 87% of the scientific community understands and agrees with evolution, and 32% of the public does. There's two interesting statistics there. First, the political strain that it creates between the public and the scientific community, and then that curious question, what about the 13% of scientists that don't believe in evolution? You also can have tensive science between cooperating adversaries. On the right is Albert Sabin meeting in the 70s with Soviet scientists. This is cooperating adversaries. And this is more recent Israeli-Palestinian consultations on water science needed for water management. You also can have tensive science between not cooperating adversaries, but reluctant nations. Here, most recently, in the Iran-US negotiations, nuclear science and engineering has played almost an unprecedented role in diplomatic negotiations. This is an interesting photograph. It shows between, at the time, reluctant adversaries. This is the signing in 1980 of an agreement between Cuba and the Cuban Academy of Sciences and the Smithsonian. And you'll note the handsome man on the far right holding the document for the signatory. That's our colleague, Sergio, and who will be speaking next. So remember this photograph of him. And like we just heard, this is collaboration with North Korea. So all of those between reluctant nations, reluctant adversaries, is part of what I call tensive science. But it also includes doing science with the enemy. Doing science with the enemy. This is a photograph of the result of Operation Paperclip during the Second World War. And Operation Paperclip was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Sciences, Services, which you'll hear later in just a moment. The OSS was charged with bringing out, under Operation Paperclip, Nazi scientists during the war, not after, but during the war, evacuating them out of Germany as it fell to the Allies, getting them back into the United States and integrating them into U.S. society. So it was a deliberate attempt to do science with the enemy. Now, that's not the only kind of tensive science where there's political strain, because political strain can emerge out of science during crisis. Not science about crises, like preparing for climate change or preparing for an earthquake, but what are the distinctive characteristics of science during the crisis itself? And for many of us who have been involved in such work, my work was with the Deepwater Horizon, Hurricane Sandy, as co-leading the Strategic Sciences Group for the Park Service, for the Department of Interior. There are models for how to do this science during crisis, and interestingly enough, the models flow from several distinctive characteristics. The first is during crisis, the challenge of collaboration and interdisciplinary teams. In our particular case, we took our model and organizational inspiration from the same group that did Operation Paperclip, the Office of Strategic Services, who during the war had an active scientific group dealing with high-level political strain, that is science to help with the war effort, in addition to the struggles both within the U.S. espionage system and external to the resistance. There were several characteristics there that are unique. One of them, of course, is focus on the mission, not the process. And for example, the description that you provide, John, the ability to do that volcano work was because it was the mission, not the process, that led to it. A second example, which is quite revolutionary in Washington, D.C., is expertise, not representation. That during science, during crisis, it's the wrong time to say we need one person from the Forest Service, one person from the EPA, one person, as opposed to the best expertise approaching the problem. And the third is General Donovan, who led the OSS. One of his criteria for evaluating scientists who would work well in the OSS doing this research is he wanted a personal quality of them that I believe still has merit today. His ideal candidate was, quote, a PhD that could win a bar fight, because he needed the best scientists who had both physical and moral strength, and physical strength we should not underrate, to be able to work long hours under hard conditions and have a thick skin to be able to focus on the mission, not the process. So, and by the way, I used that for our strategic sciences group as criteria for the deployment of operational teams. A PhD could win a bar fight. That goes for both men and women. At one point, I interviewed a top medical toxicologist. She said, I have not won a bar fight, but my husband's a cop, and I whoop him all the time. And I said, that's good enough. That's good enough. And so the OSS provides that kind of model. This is the DOI Strategic Sciences Working Group working during the crisis. A second distinctive characteristic is the raised importance of uncertainties. During political strain and during crisis, while the scientific community is used to dealing in uncertainties, translating those into policy for policymakers is both essential and part an art form. The approach we've taken and others have, this is from Weiss, borrowed from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Policy Assessment, and fifth assessment, the policy framework, is to have a scale from certain to not possible levels of scientific uncertainty and attach it to each of the potential policy implications that science delivers, without attaching a systematic evaluation of the uncertainty of the science that the scientific community does. The policy-making community during crisis can't really use it. They cannot really use it. And so that would be a second distinctive characteristic, emphasizing and translating scientific uncertainty. A third is the demands of communicating science during crisis. How many of you have heard, and for the young persons here, integrated into your thinking the idea of a elevator speech? You've heard that. I have learned that that is romantically naive, that you would get with a leader in a quiet, dry, safe, unwindy elevator and actually be able to go up several floors having an intelligent conversation with the leader. A more realistic picture is to have a helicopter pad speech so that you can walk from here to that clock. As the secretary's putting on his helmet, the rotor blades are going, the National Guard's yelling at him, 6 other people are talking to him, and you've forgotten your iPad, so you must draw the chart you're trying to explain on your palm and hold it to him and resist the idea of just pressing the ink against his forehead and say, look in a mirror and you'll figure it out. It's absolutely essential that we invest in being able to communicate during crisis, which includes powerful visualization and speed. This is a USGS report on potential earthquake damage and fatalities that is automated and comes out within 30 minutes of a major earthquake anywhere on the earth. So timeliness matters. The academic cycle of communicating science during crisis is essentially worthless. It is absolutely essential to get outside that culture and active. Our goal in the SSG is to have actionable peer review for managers, policy managers, in 6 hours. If they have a scientific question and they say, we need to know this because we need to make a decision tomorrow, they go to sleep, they wake up the next morning with actionable peer review. Measuring in hours, science during crisis can work. And another element is the capacity to speak truth to power. The trade the scientific community has to make is, yes, we can do this work during crisis and during political strain, but we have to be able to communicate it directly to those decision makers and not through the traditional forms of the academic and scientific enterprise. This is Oppenheimer talking to General Grove. But here's the opposite picture. This is actually a quite significant picture during Deepwater Horizon of the president being briefed on the decision whether to build the Burma Islands. There is no scientist in the helicopter. There is no scientist in the helicopter. So speaking truth to power is a distinctive element. Now, I have four, there might be five, intensive science modest proposals if we want to improve science diplomacy during times of political strain. The first is we need to research best practices. I find it ironic that the scientific community, so interested in evidence-based decision-making, invests so little in studying itself the sociology of science during crisis, or the sociology of tensive science during political strain, to actually identify what are the best practices and what are not. So, ironically, we need to invest in the scientific method to learn best practices. A second modest proposal is we need to invest in pre-crisis protocols. When the crisis happens, whether, for example, it's Deepwater Horizon oil that may circle through the Gulf Coast and move to Cuba, or whether it is Hurricane Sandy and its first impact on the Caribbean and its secondary impact on New Jersey, if you wait to deal under political strain for protocols for collecting data or protocols for sharing until the crisis happens, it's too late. There has to be a serious investment in pre-crisis protocols. A third modest proposal is we must always nurture back channels. Yes, there are all these things we need to do that are straightforward, that are in the front, that are visible, that governments take credit for, that the AAAS can publish in Science Magazine as a news article. But in addition to that, we must never realize that intensive science depends on the potential to use back channels. And we need to nurture those during non-political strain times so they remain open and viable when intensive science is required. The fourth is we need to continue to train skilled science diplomats. And I don't know whether it's best to say science diplomats or diplomat scientists. The key is there has to be someone who can interpret the science, and remember that means the uncertainties as well, and do so within the diplomatic realm and in the diplomatic language. And so we need to invest training and skill of the next generation of scientists who see tensive science as actually a legitimate professional activity and are well prepared to do it. And the last one is I'm convinced that, like the Olympics, we might be wise as a globe to convene and create an international site that could serve as a third-party convening location for science during political crisis. A site that would have all the assets needed to do it well, all the capacity to support the scientific discussions, a third-party locale, and devoted to doing scientific work during political strain. For too long, countries like the US and Cuba would have to meet third party in Mexico. For too long in an emergency in a volcano, you've got to find a place to meet and a way to work. If there had been, and if we create a venue that is skilled and specialized intensive science, the benefits might be significant. And lastly, there is a moral agenda associated with intensive science. For often the stakes are extraordinarily high. And all of us who are involved in it, all of us, I believe, who have the fortune to be able to be involved in this, should remember that the moral agenda includes advancing science and serving society. The water is rising. Please. And they ran out of paint. Thank you.